Are we ready? Awesome. Thank you. All right, folks, welcome back. Looks like we still have a couple folks joining, but out of respect for folks' time, we'll go ahead and get started. Again, just feel free to put any questions in the chat, and we'll grab those at the end and try and get as many answers as we can, or takeaways for the PMO ops team for action items or follow-ups and so forth. So we're going to end today's session with risk and issue management. This is a topic I think you're going to see more and more as we get into 2022. As I mentioned, there are even going to be some compliance initiatives happening to make sure we're managing the risk on our projects and not just getting hit by issues and causing change, but we're very actively going in and, sorry. I do not think I'm muted, but let me check. Is that better? Can you hear me? Marty?
You're loud and clear.
Okay, all right. Okay, so shoot, sorry, lost a little train of thought there, but we're really trying to get a heavier focus on proactively managing these things. So meeting with the team on a weekly basis, really appreciating all the things that could go wrong. So having those conversations. There's even some tools that we're going to be putting together that you can use for your sessions with your teams, that has essentially a list of questions or a list of areas that we generally see risk exist within IT. Some of those tools already exist in our tools and templates, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but really getting much more methodical about our risk management. A lot of times, as I mentioned earlier, when we see a lot of change on projects, it's because it's a high risk project that maybe with the right escalation, with the right engagement from folks from a mitigation standpoint, or even an investment in your mitigation plan, could spend a little money to mitigate something, like bring in a resource and train them just in case this other resource gets occupied with other projects or prioritized on other stuff. So there's things that you can do that potentially require a little investment. We can have those conversations with leadership and make it, and then it'll cause a much bigger, it will cause us to not have that much bigger impact later in the project. So really starting to get much more methodical about thinking through that, having those conversations, making sure we're considering all the potential risks to your projects. And then even tying that back to your contingency, making sure that your contingency budget matches the riskiness of this implementation or this rollout or whatever you're delivering. But make sure that if there's a gap, meaning, when you got funding, they said you're going to get 5% contingency or 10% contingency, but then you're doing a risk assessment and you're finding out you're really under budgeted for contingency, making that known to leadership so they understand that there's a potential you could be coming back for more dollars if all of these, high probability risks take place. So getting much more methodical about that, but then even starting to track it to your schedule. So you're going to start to see where we're going to say, okay, at an activity level, where do these risks tie? So that we know when we hit that activity, that's when we're closing out that risk, or that's potentially where we're going to hit the impact of that risk. So you're going to start to see much more maturity and much more I guess, in the expectations around how you're managing the risk related to your project. So that's why this is going to become a very hot topic going into 2020. You'll start to see more focused training, more focused compliance reporting. So this become much more visible. So just kind of starting from the top. So I assume, anyone who's had a lot of experience doing project management, risk, issues, decision change, not new concepts. I guess where I think some people sometimes lose the relationship is how one leads to the next. So I've heard, you know, a lot of people confuse, oh, I have this issue when it's really a risk, or I have this risk when it's really an issue, and not see the correlation as to one leading to the other. So before you really even do any work on the project, you should be doing a risk assessment, a qualitative risk assessment. During that qualitative risk assessment, you're talking about all the things that could happen. Anything that could go wrong, could impact your project. When you're thinking about your stakeholders, any potential, you know, issues you could have in engagement with your stakeholder, any potential, you know, if there's a stakeholder who doesn't really want this system in place, there could be risk associated with adoption of the system or getting a comprehensive requirements, or, you know, so you really are thinking about all the things that could go wrong even before you start, but not just when you start. You should be thinking about what could go wrong. As a PM, I'd be thinking about that on a weekly basis. So you're trying to see way ahead and stop the train wreck before it happens. That is, in my mind, one of the, besides communication, it is the next highest important skill that a PM has. So a PM that does risk management really well is much more likely to be successful and is much more of an asset to a project than a PM who puts together a very detailed schedule. That is important, but a project coordinator could do that. The person who is really good at anticipating things that could go wrong and preventing them from going wrong is your greatest asset as a PM on a project. So getting really good at this is, I think, one of the most important skills to work on as a PM. Communication, like I said, being the other. So a risk is what could go wrong on your project. An issue is, I had this risk that something could go wrong, and now it is an issue. It has turned into an issue. So this is something that is currently impacting my project. It did go wrong. That doesn't always mean that it affects your final end date. It doesn't always mean that your budget inflates, but something has gone wrong. So a risk always comes first. There's a risk that something can happen. An issue is it actually is happening. And then the change is it is impacting my project. So once you have an issue, the issue may be something that you have to deal with as a PM, you have to resolve, but may not impact your end date, may not impact your budget. If it does, that results in a change. And the decision is really, do I want to absorb this change? Do I want to shut this project down? Do I want, you know, the decision is really around like the resolution and accepting the change. So I have this issue, I have this resolution that may require something, you know, from my sponsor, or something from my team, or something from my leadership. That's where the decision point comes in. Maybe a change in technology direction, maybe a change in design, maybe a change in requirements. That's where your decision comes in. And then based on that decision, that'll help you better assess the actual impact, which is your change request. And that change request is only if it's actually impacting your final dates, your budget, negative or positive over a certain percentage. So it's important to understand that relationship. You always have a risk first, then it becomes an issue, you make a decision, then it results in a change. And the reason this is important is because once we put the new change request process in place, I mean, the goal is to have a change board that reviews these change requests. I've been on some of these boards, and the first question I always ask is, did you have a registered risk, and what did you do to mitigate it before it impacted your project, before it became an issue? Some, you know, risks you just couldn't have known, but most you could. When people say, oh, my business partner just decided to change the requirements on me, I couldn't possibly have known that. Well, you could have known that this is an area that is a little bit more unstable or doesn't have a good perception of the technology and how it facilitates their business process. Or you could have prototyped something for them so that they can give you better requirements. So generally just the business wanted it isn't a reason. You could have known there was a risk. There's things that could mitigation that could have happened before it impacted your project. So on a change control board, a lot of times that's the types of things that we're thinking about. And when I say change control, I mean approving change or project change requests, changes to budgets, changes to scopes, changes to timelines. So that process is also coming. It wasn't part of the foundation, but it is absolutely needed and hopefully coming next year. As part of that, that's why I want to make sure you are thinking about this from the perspective of identifying all those risks, like knowing your business area, knowing if they're resource constrained, knowing if you have commitment for this project or if they have competing priorities. So things like that is important for you, not just your only risk isn't related to your part of the delivery. It's related to anything that could impact you from delivering this project. So I thought it was important to level set on that, because I think people sometimes think of these things differently. And one is a cause of the next. And it goes from risk to issues to decision to change. So across the life, cycle of, across the life of your project, you're gonna have different levels of maturity in your risk assessments and in kind of how you're thinking about risk. So at the very beginning, it's very qualitative, very high level. So when you develop your business case, you're not to a point where you have executed like a PERT method, or I think we used to actually use Monte Carlo simulation. You're not going to that level of detail on your risk assessment. It is really just, here are the things that I could go wrong. There's the probability and potential impact at a scale level, high, medium, low, that sort of thing. So you're not breaking it down to what's the most it could possibly cost me, what's the least it could possibly cost me. That is what you'll get to in quantitative risk assessment. And I'm going to go through that a little bit more detailed and kind of show you the model that you should be using. But that really comes at develop initial design. So until develop initial design, you're still at that qualitative level. And really, once you get past that and you're in that quantitative state, you should even be thinking about your risk contingency estimates. So if my risks are really high for this delivery, and I only have, like I said, a very small contingency budget, I would state that in my statuses and make it clear that this is a very risky implementation. We're going to move forward, but there's a high potential that change is going to happen to my budget just based on the contingency allowance and my contingency budget and what I'm seeing happening in my risk. And then, towards the end, you start looking at it as lessons learned and closing those out. So there's 5 stages of your risk, which is identification, analysis, response, monitor and control, and closure. And these are the ones that you'll see set up in the tool as well. So, at the beginning, you're just identifying the risk. I would say throughout, you're identifying risk. So if you're actually actively having these conversations with your project teams, or you yourself is adding, light of where you've maybe done this on another project, the things that have gone wrong, that sort of thing. I would say risk identification, people mistake that as just happening at the beginning of something. It is not at the beginning, it is throughout. You're thinking about what could go wrong additionally to what you already know. You're also assessing it for impact, probability, and so on. That you should also be doing throughout. So once it's identified, you should keep going back and saying, oh, okay, well, now we figured this part of the solution out. We may want to reduce this risk down to, a certain percentage, or we figure this solution out. It looks way more complicated than we even originally thought. We may want to up the probability of this risk happening. Your response, really what your options and actions you can take to reduce that threat. So again, if you have a risk to your resources that this one resource is the only person at PSEG who can help you and they are completely overwhelmed, I would bring forth the possibility of hiring a contractor to shadow them for a certain amount of time and say, hey, it's going to cost us this more, but we're more likely to deliver. Let your stakeholders and your steering committee weigh into that so that they have ownership in that decision. So as the PM, you are doing everything you can to keep this on track. You're keeping them informed, and they are playing a part in deciding whether they want to mitigate that risk and make that investment, or deal with it in a way that potentially could result in a change to the project. So that's really, in my mind, how you want to approach that. Make sure you're looking at the options to reduce that threat. Make sure you're looking and you're sharing that decision making with your leadership, with your steering committee, with your project sponsor. And then monitoring, controlling. So like as it's there, like constantly reassessing, as I said, some you'll have to close out, like you'll pass the point where it's a risk to your project, making sure you're keeping all of that up to date. And you're constantly verifying, the efficiency of your response to that. And then at the end, when the risk is done, now this is not the end of the project. This is when the risk has passed. So if my risk is to design and I've designed it and it didn't happen, or if my risk is to getting a contract in place in a certain amount of time, now I have a contract, that risk should be closed out. So you should constantly be closing out your risk based on where you are in the project and does that risk still exist? Eventually, this is going to result in assessment of should you be giving contingency budget back at a certain point in your project. And again, this is kind of one of those changing cultures and an uncomfortable place for PMs, because we want to keep our contingency just in case something goes wrong. You will find a bigger push going forward to release contingency when it's no longer needed, so that it can be those dollars can be allocated to something else. If you are, if you think about it as an executive, if I have a whole portfolio of projects and I have 100 million tied up in contingency, and it's October, what's the chance that, and the projects are in, this is for the projects ending at the end of the year, what's the chances I'm going to use all of that? You're going to see the leadership starting to ask those questions. So you want to be informed about whether you need all the contingency you have, as well as if you need more. So risk identification, in ServiceNow, you will see that there are descriptions, a description, title, description, impact, probability, target, closeout date, mitigation plan, and contingency plan. And I'm hoping this is going to come up. I forgot to click it prior to this. Oh, shoot. I'll go ahead and pull it and send it out after. So the cheat sheet that I mentioned for risk identification, let me see if I can pull it up from here. I did put a cheat sheet out there so that you could take it to your risk identification sessions, and it just essentially lists out the categories of risk that exist and questions that you can ask, like just to think through with your team as to where a risk, and kind of start to bring to light. Once you start asking those questions, you will find very quickly that people are going to say, oh, wait, yeah, that's right. That probably, I've seen that go wrong in other projects. Like, yeah, I've seen that integration not really work, or, you'll start to see where people will start providing you that insight just based on you provoking those thoughts by asking the questions. So that's why it's, in my mind, important to come into those sessions and come into those conversations with a bit of a cheat sheet. And I'm looking, I don't see it here. So I'll make sure that gets sent out as well. From an analysis standpoint, when you start to think about your probability and impact from a qualitative perspective, so this is all the way up to develop initial design. We really just gave some guidelines here that you can use as you're putting in the probability levels, actual probability amounts, as well as impact. So kind of just, this is when you're thinking qualitative and just at a high level, what range am I looking at for probability and impact of this particular risk? And again, we're talking about to your schedule, scope, and cost. Once you have those, then the probability and impact, then you can create a risk index. So it's really based on a combination of those things that in this matrix that'll tell you kind of where your index is, and it'll give you critical, high, medium, and low. This is pretty common, pretty PMI standard stuff. So I suspect most people have used this type of model before, but it really just gives you kind of, based on those two factors, what's your level of risk. Once you're entering it into the risk log, like I said, there's fields in ServiceNow under, and I showed earlier where you click the new risk, you can actually start putting this information in. We've added a lot of these fields specifically so you could do more detailed risk management. Status, I think, you know, open, hold, canceled, close, that's pretty self-explanatory. Created your target close date. So when do we think this risk is either going to be mitigated and you can close it out, or essentially expires. The date that you actually close it out, the owner, category. So is it external? Is it a project management risk? Is it a technical risk? You know, so really, where does this risk fall? These are more just sequential numbers and things to help organize. Then a short description, and then an actual description that is much more clear as to what is the risk and why are you considering these potential impacts. Mitigation plan, you have notes, probability, impact, and then a risk score. So that is at the early stages when you're still doing qualitative. So this was in the status report as well, but you have this risk tab here. You just click new and it'll allow you to create and also update your risk. All right. I'm not going to go through it. It's pretty much the same regardless of which stage until you get to quantitative risk. When you get to quantitative risk assessments is where it starts to get much more detailed and probably a little bit away from what some people are accustomed to doing on their projects. So if you've done a lot of project light is what I call it, without a formal methodology in place, you probably weren't required to do quantitative risk assessments where it resulted in a value that you should be looking at as your reserve for your contingency budget, where you would estimate your costs, minimum cost impact, most likely, maximum cost impact, and then you use a calculation to get to an actual contingency amount. So I'll jump through that to that. If you've worked for a very mature organization like I have in the past, you potentially have done Monte Carlo simulation around this. Monte Carlo simulation, just for folks who don't know, takes all of this information and then says how much tolerance does your organization have for an impact based on to your projects or your portfolio of projects. So we're building a nuclear power plant. The investment is obviously fairly high. You don't want your risk to double that investment that you've already communicated to regulators. So you'll do this Monte Carlo simulation and it'll say, how much tolerance do you have for a change, for absorbing cost? And if you say it's 10%, it'll come up with a number and say, well, this is how much you should be carrying in your contingency budget. We did a much more watered down version for this because Monte Carlo simulation requires a whole different tool. So we're using the PERT method. Anyone who's got their PMP certification has probably heard of this. But it is your minimum cost impact plus your most likely cost impact times 4, plus your maximum cost impact, all divided by 6. And then that gives you a contingency, a recommended contingency amount. So when we're looking at this, we usually look at it based on the probability. So if you have a risk and you say the probability of occurrence is 80%, which resulted in this, contingency of 16,000, I would say you factor anything above 50% probability into your estimate for contingency, but your contingency budget doesn't have to include every single one of your risk contingency estimates. And the reason is that if it's not likely to happen, you probably don't. If it's like 10% or 20% likely to happen, you probably don't need to carry contingency for it. Which is why I would say a good number is 50% and up. If your probability is 50% and up, you can add these numbers together, and that's really what you should be looking at for your contingency budget. And I know I jumped quickly from qualitative to quantitative, so just to add a little bit more background to this. I mean, your qualitative risk assessment, as I mentioned before, let me go back a little, is really just at a high level, right? Like, I'm just thinking about what's my risk, how probable is it, what's the potential like magnitude of the impact. Once you get to these quantitative risk assessments, it involves you digging in to each risk and thinking much more about, like, if a resource leaves, how much do I think that's going to cost me, either in another resource, in time that I have to pay another vendor to wait until I get a new resource, whatever things could cost you more money associated with this risk. What's the least, it could cost me, what's the most it could cost me, and then what's most likely. These are pretty distributed pretty evenly. That is not always the case. You really have to think about what is the most likely, least, and I usually involve at least my technical, if it's a technical one, I involve my technical lead. If it's a resource one, I involve whoever owns that resource to help provide that estimate for me. If you were able to sit in on the PM session that Bill Berge held, where he went through an example of using stage gate process for his project for GIS, you saw where he actually held quantitative risk sessions with his team and his stakeholders, and he actually has full logs of all of this where he used this and came up with contingency and things like that. It is recorded, so if any of you want to go back and listen to that, where he said basically this is how he used the stage gate process and the templates for his project through the life, although he's not finished, so it only goes to a certain part, but he did do the quantitative risk assessments. So hopefully this isn't that foreign of a concept for folks. It's, like I said, it's a watered down version, I think, of quantitative risk assessments. But once you get to these numbers, then you can start as a PM thinking about, do I have the right level of contingency, or am I under my contingency budget? Should I only have 10%, it looks like 20% risk associated with my project. You may not need to go add that contingency right away, especially if you're early in the project, but it's something you're going to want to monitor, and it's something you're going to want to communicate. So from a risk response planning, obviously there's avoidance, transfer, minimize, acceptance. So here are just some definitions and examples you can use to figure out what your strategy is going to be for responding to that risk. Like I said, in most cases, this minimize is usually warrants a really good discussion with your stakeholders to say, hey, I can take this action. It's going to cost you a little bit, but it may save you a lot if this risk occurs. So those are the kind of things you really want to plan in, at least the conversations you want to plan in. And then finally, once you hit a point where that risk has either expired, or you think you've mitigated it and you potentially can reduce it to very little or no probability, that's when you'll close it out. Or it became an issue. So as your risk become an issue, you may need to convert it unless it remains a risk on your project. If you have an issue and I resolve this issue and it doesn't reduce the risk, you're going to want to leave it there. Just some important notes, I think. As I mentioned before, it is a key to effective project management. In my mind, good project managers are really strong at this, because this is what keeps projects on track. And every project has risk, every project has issues. This is what the skill that I think minimizes those issues, minimizes that impact, and in order to help keep things on track. So one of the most important skills a PM can have. Every project has risk, and mitigating those is going to be key for you. The assessments should be done every week, whether it's with just you or your team and your stakeholders, depending on the nature of your project. At minimum, you should be evaluating, do you still have the right set of risk and what else can go wrong every week? And I would say making sure they're updated at least before your status reports are due. Communication and escalation of risk, very important. And that's kind of why I mentioned in the status reporting, you turn yellow. It's not a reflection of you as a PM unless you don't have a good story to go with it, meaning you can't say what you're doing to mitigate it or what help you need, or, just stating the risk is not good PM. Stating the risk and then actively managing, mitigating, and communicating is and escalating as appropriate is what the skill is about. Accurate closeout dates going to be very important in the future when we start looking at releasing contingency based on those things. Risk register auditing and compliance is coming soon, as I mentioned. And then contingency estimate management based on those risks is also coming soon. And with that was all that I had to share today. I know it's a lot. Hopefully, most of you have done this type of risk management before. I think if you've only managed small projects or in small companies, generally they only do qualitative. So the quantitative may be new. And if that's the case, definitely, let the EPMO ops team know if you need help with that, how to use the templates, how to, kind of think about this. But I am hoping that some specialized risk management training on how to use the tools, go through some case studies is coming early next year. Any questions for me? All right. Well, as we stated early on, unfortunately, the estimation we were not able to do today, but there is some changes coming with that, and you will see that resurrected for the January session. Any other closing comments, Salita? Anything I missed? I see you're back on.
Yes, I don't think you missed anything. You mentioned earlier on that we would not be reviewing estimation today. Just in case there's anyone new that's joined the call, the estimation tool is being updated, and we will have special topic training around that in January or so. So I think that's the only thing I would reiterate, Sharon. Thanks.
And I think if you need it immediately prior to that, there is recorded sessions out there that you can pick up as well, right, Salita, in the training directories?
Yes, there are recorded sessions out there. So if someone needs that information, you can simply send an email to the EPMO mailbox and we can direct you to it if you can't find it.
Right. All right, well, I will say thank you guys for joining today. Hopefully we got most of your questions answered. I know there, Patrick, for you, there was some areas we're gonna follow up on. And then I would say as you guys start using this, please join the PM GPM forum, provide feedback. If there are things that's not working for you that we need to update, I definitely think that's part of this process. So make sure you're communicating that to the ops team so they can get on the list for future releases. It's also not totally comprehensive. We had a roadmap that was kind of put on hold so that the team could ramp up. So there are gaps in here that are going to be part of your 2022 and 2023 EPMO roadmap to start filling those as well. And with that, I'll say thank you for your attention, and everybody enjoy the rest of your day.